I made a dreadful mistake, and I'm afraid I'll have to face the consequences for the rest of my life. You can call me Cindy. I'm 23 years old, and my boyfriend is Cameron, who is 25. We both come from the same small town in Oklahoma. Though he was a couple of years older than me, we were more like casual acquaintances. This changed about 3 years ago when I worked as a cashier at a grocery store. Cameron would often stop by during weekends or breaks from college to grab some pre-made meals and a kombucha tea for lunch. My shift usually had me working the express checkout, and whenever he was there, he would choose my line. Cameron always treated me with kindness and politeness, which I found incredibly endearing. There was something about the sound of his voice that made my heart flutter and sent shivers down my spine. I tried to drop subtle hints to show him that I was interested, but he just didn't seem to catch on. One day, while he was checking out and my line was moving slowly, I decided to take the plunge and start a conversation. I asked him about his major in college and kept the questions coming as a way to demonstrate my interest. After about 10 minutes, it finally seemed like the light bulb turned on for him. Right as a couple of shoppers with full baskets were heading my way, he said, "Looks like you're getting busy here. Let me give you my number." He quickly wrote it down on the receipt I handed him and left, suggesting I should call him whenever I had some free time. That Saturday was a turning point for me. The moment my shift ended at 3 p.m., I rushed to my car and dialed his number. To my surprise, we ended up talking for 2 full hours. By the end of our conversation, he invited me out for dinner that very night, and without hesitation, I said yes. The chemistry between us was instant and electric. By the time our second date rolled around, which was just the following day before he returned to school, we had already become intimate. It might sound crazy, but that weekend, I fell head over heels in love with him. From that point, we began seeing each other every weekend. Sometimes Cameron would come back home, and other times I would make the trip to his college to spend meaningful time together. Everything was going wonderfully. After graduating, Cameron landed a solid job in the city, bought a new Wrangler, and secured a nice apartment close to his workplace. A few months later, he proposed that I move in with him, and I eagerly jumped at the chance. Although our parents were not entirely on board with us living together before marriage, they supported our relationship because they liked both of us. Cameron made it clear to both me and our parents that this was more like a trial run to assess our compatibility for marriage. I was on cloud 9. Our relationship was thriving, and we were both thoroughly enjoying life in the city after growing up in a small, rural town. Living in a bustling city opened up a world of activities and interesting people to meet. It felt like we had truly found our place. I was fortunate enough to secure a job at a locally owned coffee shop just a few blocks from our apartment. I loved it there. The owners were warm and welcoming, and our customers were fascinating individuals. I had the chance to meet many wonderful people and even managed to keep in touch with most of my regulars through social media. By this time, Cameron and I had been cohabitating for nearly 9 months, though he had been living in the apartment for about 10 months before I moved in. We started to feel a little bit restless, curious about what other options were out there, so we began exploring different apartments in the area. Although we adored our current place, it was fun to check out various designs and layouts. If we decided to move, Cameron would have to give written notice to our landlord a month in advance to avoid an automatic lease renewal. A month later, I decided to join a local yoga class that was within walking distance of our apartment, though it was in the opposite direction from my coffee shop. We were excited about the possibilities ahead, but little did I know that a single decision would change everything. One of the regulars at the yoga studio also happened to be a frequent visitor to our coffee shop. For the sake of privacy, let's just call him Ed. He was an attractive older gentleman, appearing to be in his late 40s, which I estimated was around the same age as my parents. Ed always struck me as a well-built man, exuding a certain charm that drew people in. He was exceptionally friendly and engaging, making a point to converse with everyone at the coffee shop, not just me. Ed would often spend a couple of hours each day working on his laptop while sipping his favorite coffee, creating an almost constant presence in our little establishment. During our casual exchanges, Ed mentioned that he was an entrepreneur. My assumption was that he must have been successful, given that he drove a brand new Bronco and consistently sported stylish clothing, including matching shoes and eye-catching jewelry. One day, feeling curious about his apparent passion for yoga, I initiated a conversation with him and asked if he would recommend the yoga studio he attended. Ed enthusiastically encouraged me to give yoga a try, suggesting that I would likely enjoy it. His enthusiasm piqued my interest. After mulling over his suggestion, I decided to visit the yoga studio myself. Upon touring the facility, I found it to be quite appealing. One of the significant factors that attracted me was its convenient location. It was within walking distance from our apartment. In contrast, my boyfriend Cameron was a member of a large gym situated just across the street from his office. That gym was more than 20 minutes away from our home. With traffic, that commute could easily stretch to 35 minutes or more. I wasn't keen on the idea of driving my old, beat-up Saturn for such a long distance, so the yoga studio felt like an ideal solution. I began attending yoga classes and quickly developed a strong fondness for the practice. My schedule allowed for this new interest to flourish. I typically headed to the yoga studio right after my work shift ended at 2 p.m. This routine fit seamlessly into my day, as I followed a schedule of working from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., attending yoga classes until about 3:30 p.m., and then returning home to prepare dinner for Cameron. During one of my shifts at the coffee shop, Ed was curious about my experience at the yoga studio. I expressed my enthusiasm for the classes and thanked him sincerely for the recommendation. He asked me about my schedule, and I shared that I attended right after work at 2 p.m. Ed then mentioned that he was considering starting to attend classes around that same time as well. He explained that he planned to incorporate hot yoga into his routine a few days a week, with those classes starting at 1:30 p.m. He also revealed that he spent 3 or 4 days a week at a local gym, focusing on weightlifting and boxing. A couple of days later, I bumped into Ed at the yoga studio. Just like our interactions at the coffee shop, we engaged in an easygoing conversation. Eventually, he convinced me to try a hot yoga class. I gave it a shot and was pleasantly surprised to discover that I loved it. As time went on, our connection deepened. We began spending more and more time together at the studio, often taking classes back to back. Looking back, I can recognize that this situation was inappropriate, yet at the time, such thoughts never crossed my mind. This routine continued for several weeks, building a unique bond. However, one fateful Thursday afternoon, I found myself at Cameron's apartment with Ed, an unexpected turn of events that led to something truly regrettable. The situation escalated into a mistake that I would come to deeply regret. Afterward, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for my actions, yet reluctantly, I agreed to meet Ed again at his place the following Monday. I didn't want to disrespect Cameron by inviting Ed back to his home. When I arrived at Ed's apartment, I was taken aback by the surroundings. The neighborhood had a somewhat sketchy vibe, far from what I had anticipated. The apartment itself was sparsely furnished with only a couple of old chairs, a television, a small dining table with 2 chairs, a modest double bed, and an aged dresser. It wasn't what I had expected and made me consider leaving, but I didn't want to appear rude or dismissive. As I looked around, it became clear that Ed hadn't invested as much in his living space as I had assumed he would have. Instead, it seemed he had spent most of his money on his car, clothes, and jewelry. Following that encounter, I came to a conclusion. I needed to terminate our relationship. It was a realization that weighed heavily on me, as I truly loved my boyfriend, Cameron, and didn't want to jeopardize what we had built together. Ed looked at me with a mix of disbelief and amusement, chuckling as he made a pointed remark that pierced through the air like an arrow. "You can't possibly love your boyfriend if you just did what you did, can you?" I felt a wave of defensiveness rise in me, pushing me to respond. "I do love him more than anything," I insisted, trying to convey the truth of my feelings. But Ed wasn't buying it. He shot back, "Well, you may love him, but your desire for me outweighs your feelings for him by far." His words hit me hard, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. It was a harsh reality check that I wasn't fully prepared to face. "No, that's not true," I insisted, my voice laced with desperation as I gathered my things. Leaving Ed's apartment felt like walking away from a part of myself that I couldn't quite understand. As I stepped outside, a heavy sense of shame washed over me, leaving me feeling tainted and utterly foolish for my actions. This wasn't who I was, I promised myself. Somehow, I had stumbled into a moment I never thought I would. I tried to rationalize it in my mind. Maybe it was just the timing. Hormones had a tendency to turn my life upside down at certain times of the month. It felt like a flimsy excuse, yet I clung to it as I spent the afternoon in tears, the burden of guilt weighing me down. When Cameron returned home later, I attempted to push my inner turmoil aside. We had dinner, watched some TV, and settled on the couch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cameron seemed distant, almost like he was a million miles away. He'd been feeling unwell for a few days, so at first, I assumed that was the reason for his mood. But then Tuesday came around, and although he appeared physically fine, he maintained that strange distance. Days stretched into a week since we'd been intimate, and a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Something felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the creeping suspicion that he might have known about my encounter with Ed. As I replayed the last week's interactions, doubt gnawed at me, and I felt more isolated than ever. On Wednesday, I hurried home just before 3 p.m., reaching for my apartment key only to realize it was missing from my key ring. Panic surged through me as I rummaged through my belongings, my mind racing with possibilities. The key itself wasn't broken, every other key was still there, but the apartment key was nowhere to be found. My mind spiraled into darker places. What if someone had taken it? Suddenly, a chilling thought struck me. Could Cameron have removed it to cut off access to our shared space? Frantically, I called Cameron several times and sent text messages, but my efforts were met with silence. This was unusual. He usually replied quickly, even if it was just to let me know he was busy. Feeling desperate, I decided to go to the apartment office and ask them for help. They had spare keys to every unit in the building, so I explained my situation to one of the coordinators. She nodded politely, then disappeared into the manager's office, closing the door behind her. A few minutes later, I was called back into the office. The manager's expression was grave as she gestured for me to take a seat. She broke the news to me in a way that felt like a punch to the gut. Cameron had moved out that morning and submitted a letter to terminate the lease at the end of its term. My heart sank as I stammered out a shocked, "What?" before the tears began to flow uncontrollably. The manager informed me that several bags of Cameron's belongings had been left in an adjacent locked office. They escorted me there, and I came face to face with 3 large laundry bags containing all of my personal items. Among them were gifts I had purchased for Cameron over the years, and the realization hit me like a freight train. He must have known about my indiscretions with Ed. My emotional facade crumbled as the compassionate staff members watched, concerned, as I fell apart. They kindly offered to help carry the bags to my car, urging me to sit down for a moment to regain my composure. One of them inquired if there was anyone they could contact on my behalf, but I shook my head, assuring them I could handle it alone. I mentioned that I just needed time to collect my thoughts and that I planned to sit in my car for a little while longer. I asked if Cameron had provided a forwarding address, but they explained that privacy regulations prevented them from disclosing that information. Their kindness was a small comfort amidst the chaos. They offered me bottled water, granola bars, and tissues, and I gratefully accepted, knowing that I needed to avoid making rash decisions in such a vulnerable state. For over an hour, I sat in my car, sobbing softly as I pondered what to do next. I kept trying to reach Cameron, calling his cell and leaving more messages, asking if I could stay in the now empty apartment until the lease ended. Knowing he was the one responsible for the bills, the silence was deafening, and with each unanswered attempt, my sense of loss deepened. I had hoped that the question I posed would spark some kind of reaction, but unfortunately, it did nothing of the sort. The silence was almost deafening, and I could sense the anger radiating from him. It was evident that he was furious, yet interestingly enough, he had not blocked my calls or messages. This small detail provided me with a glimmer of hope, a sliver of possibility that maybe there was still a chance for communication between us. In a moment of weakness, I briefly considered driving to his office to confront him directly. The urge to face him, to talk this out, was strong. However, I quickly dismissed that idea. I didn't want to create a scene at his workplace. That was the last thing I wanted to do. It was important to me that I did nothing to jeopardize his job or tarnish his professional reputation. He held a significant position within the company, and his career was promising. I could not and would not be the reason for any downfall in that area. Instead of confronting him, I found myself driving aimlessly through the city for about an hour, lost in my thoughts and emotions as I pondered my next steps. Eventually, I decided to check into a hotel that had recently opened in our neighborhood, called Homestyle Suites. They were running a grand opening special that offered rates as low as $1.79 per night or $1,399 per week. Even though I knew I couldn't afford to stay there for long, it felt essential to find a temporary place away from everything. Once I settled into the hotel room, the floodgates opened, and I spent the entire night in tears. I was utterly shattered, wondering how Cameron had found out the truth. In my mind, I could only come up with 2 potential scenarios that might explain how he discovered what had happened. The first possibility was that Ed had informed him directly or through someone else. The second, and far more unsettling thought, was that Cameron might have had surveillance cameras set up in our apartment. The idea of being watched made my skin crawl. I fervently hoped it was the first option. The thought of Cameron actually witnessing me with another man was too much to bear. Shame washed over me like a heavy blanket, crushing me under the weight of what I had done. I felt like the worst person imaginable. I had inflicted pain on the person I loved most, who had treated me so well in every way. The following day, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was filled with fury, more enraged than I had ever heard her. "What on earth did you do?" she demanded. I tried to feign ignorance, but she cut me off, revealing that she had just spoken with Cameron's mother. According to her, Cameron had disclosed that we had broken up because I had been intimate with an older man. The reality of the situation hit me hard, and I reluctantly admitted that what she said was true. I expressed my deep remorse, but that only prompted my mother to unleash a torrent of yelling, screaming, and tears that lasted for over 45 minutes. The call ended abruptly when she hung up on me, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever. Not long after, my dad called. His voice was heavy with disappointment. Hearing that broke my heart. I asked him if I could move back home, and he reluctantly agreed, but only on the condition that I seek professional help, perhaps a therapist. I accepted that condition, apologized once again, and asked if he still loved me. He assured me that he did love me but emphasized how overwhelming his disappointment had been. After that conversation, I handed in my resignation at the coffee shop where I had worked and returned home 11 days later. Throughout that chaotic period, I kept trying to reach out to Cameron. Each time went unanswered, he never replied. I started to do some online research and came across advice suggesting it might be best to give a betrayed partner some space. Though it was tearing me apart inside, I attempted to follow that advice. Upon my return home, it became painfully clear that everyone in town seemed to know about our breakup and the reasons behind it. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. The shame was overwhelming. Desperate for a solution, I wanted to know if there was any way to reconcile with Cameron. I was unclear about how he had uncovered the truth or what he might have seen, but given his personality, I feared he might never want to talk to me again. My love for him was deeper than I could express, and I knew I needed to make every effort possible to win him back. Regardless of the outcome, I understood that I would carry the weight of my actions as regret for the rest of my life. I hoped for compassion and understanding in any responses I received. Update: I'm now living back at home with my parents. I've taken a job as a cashier at a newly opened dollar store in town. It seems like everyone in this town is still talking about me, and I can't shake the feeling of embarrassment. Somehow, people managed to figure out that Ed was the person I cheated with, and I did some online digging. To my shock, I found out that Ed is actually 62 years old. I had no clue about his age. I always thought he was in his late 40s. What's even more troubling is the fact that he carries a criminal record that stretches back 17 years. This dark history has been documented in at least 2 newspaper articles detailing his past arrests and trials. These articles are still readily available online, which means that anyone, including myself, could have discovered this information with a straightforward internet search. Unfortunately, I was too caught up in my own thoughts and emotions to take that simple step. Reflecting on my behavior during that time frame is incredibly difficult. I often feel like an absolute fool for my actions. Not only did I betray the man I love deeply, but I did so with someone whose character is far from admirable. The weight of this realization is heavy, and I find myself hoping that the gossip circulating through town will eventually fade away in the coming months. The thought of remaining in this environment for much longer feels unbearable, as it is taking a significant toll on my mental health. There are days when the idea of locking myself away in my room, avoiding the outside world completely, feels like the only escape. My parents have expressed their disappointment and embarrassment regarding my choices. They've communicated their stance clearly. If I ever find myself in a similar situation again, they would not hesitate to disown me. They feel that I have brought immense shame upon the family, a sentiment that only intensifies my feelings of self-loathing. I have been battling severe depression due to this entire ordeal. Throughout this distressing time, Cameron has not reached out to me, and we have not exchanged a single word since the night he locked me out of our apartment. I find myself yearning for him to pick up the phone, to express his anger or any emotion, really. At this moment, I would do anything for the chance to apologize to him face to face. I believe it would provide me with a sense of closure that I desperately need. In an effort to cope, I have been attending therapy for a few weeks now, and it has proven to be beneficial. My therapist strikes a balance between compassion and directness, guiding me through this tough period. Following her advice, I have refrained from making any attempts to contact Cameron and have instead channeled my energy into self-improvement. She reminded me that I have already reached out to him through text and voicemail, and he is aware of my apologies. Clearly, he wants to maintain his distance at this time. Over the past week, I have focused on my job, maintaining a balanced diet, ensuring I get enough rest, and taking long walks, which have helped me feel a bit better. However, the absence of my partner still weighs heavily on my heart. Each day, I take things as they come, holding on to hope for a reconciliation with Cameron. While also bracing myself for the possibility that it may never happen, I have received several requests from customers at the store to go out. I have no intention of dating anyone anytime soon. My heart and mind remain firmly connected to Cameron. Unless there is a reunion, I do not foresee providing any updates on my situation. Moving on, I am now nearing the end of my divorce after being married for 23 years to my wife, Connie. Our journey began when I was 23 and she was just 21. We met during my third year of college, and it didn't take long for us to realize that we were meant to be together. We married shortly after she completed her degree. I began my career at a company conveniently located near my hometown, where my parents ran a working farm. This farm is substantial, with 8 full-time employees and 45 seasonal workers. Growing up, I was heavily involved in the farm, as was my brother Bill, who is 3 years my junior. Bill chose not to pursue a college education. Instead, he opted to work as a laborer on the farm. Over the years, my father attempted to offer Bill various management positions, but he preferred the simplicity of being a laborer, content with his role and the paycheck it provided. Sadly, Bill passed away from cancer earlier this year, leaving our family with an enormous loss to bear. The farm itself spans nearly 700 acres and includes 3 houses. My parents reside in the main house, which is comfortably set back from the main road and also serves as the farm office. My brother lived in the small carriage house located at the entrance of the property, right where the driveway meets the road. Meanwhile, my wife, kids, and I made our home in a farmhouse situated 3/4 of a mile down the road from my parents and brother. My parents expanded the farm by purchasing the neighboring property through the business, which allowed them to preserve the farmhouse while providing us with our own places to live rent-free. Although my parents are the only officers in the family farm corporation, they arranged for both my brother and me to inherit the farm upon their passing. Bill was to receive 45%, while I would receive 55%. This arrangement has always been a source of comfort amidst the complexities of family dynamics and personal relationships. I was given majority control of the farm because I dedicated a significant amount of my time and effort to manage it in tandem with my regular job. Although I didn't receive any direct payment for this work, the arrangement allowed my family and me to live on the property without the burden of paying rent. This setup was not only practical but also created a strong foundation for a future where I would eventually inherit the majority ownership of the farm. It was truly an ideal family environment, a place we all cherished deeply. I have 4 wonderful children. My eldest is a 21-year-old daughter, followed by a 20-year-old son, a 17-year-old son, and our youngest, a delightful 15-year-old girl. Life during this time was filled with joy and satisfaction for all of us, and I enjoyed a fulfilling and loving marriage with my wife, Connie. Our children thrived in this nurturing atmosphere, and my job was progressing smoothly. Meanwhile, the farm was flourishing, further enhancing our quality of life. Having provided you with enough context about my family and the life we built together, I want to focus on the central issue that prompted me to write this message. About 3 years ago, my brother, Bill, received a devastating diagnosis of cancer. Unfortunately, he had never been particularly good at taking care of his health and didn't seek treatment until the symptoms became unbearable. By that point, the cancer had progressed and metastasized, spreading to other parts of his body. He faced a grueling battle, undergoing both chemotherapy and radiation treatments, which took a serious toll on his body and spirit. Despite his struggles, he continued to work, demonstrating his resilience. Tragically, Bill passed away earlier this year, leaving a significant emotional void for all of us, especially for me. Bill looked up to me throughout our lives, viewing me as a role model. I had always been there to support him through various challenges he faced, and our close bond was a source of comfort for both of us. Bill had a rather routine lifestyle that largely revolved around his job and spending free time at local bars and social clubs. This pattern became a concern as he battled with a drinking problem, but I was able to help him overcome that struggle about 4 years prior to his passing. Additionally, he also encountered serious tax issues, which I stepped in to help him navigate. Despite his challenges, Bill wasn't unintelligent or lazy, he simply lacked ambition and the drive to improve his circumstances. Over the years, he dated a number of women, but it seemed none of those relationships were lasting. Most were connections made at bars, and even though he once dated a genuinely nice girl, that relationship eventually fell apart due to his drinking habits. Our parents accepted Bill for who he was, offering him unconditional love without pressure to change. They loved him just as they loved me, which fostered a sense of acceptance in our family. When Bill passed, he designated me as the executor of his estate in his will, specifying that I should inherit 100% of his assets. This included a life insurance policy, a small checking account, and his personal belongings, such as his cherished motorcycle and truck. About 2 weeks after Bill's funeral, I found myself at his home, sifting through paperwork and paying his bills. Amidst the piles of documents on his kitchen table, I stumbled upon a statement from an out-of-town bank. To my astonishment, I discovered that the account held over $70,000, a sum far beyond what I expected. However, what truly caught my attention were the names listed on the statement. The account was opened in Bill's name, and intriguingly, my youngest son, whom I'll refer to as Joe, was designated as the payable on death beneficiary. This revelation left me perplexed. I couldn't understand why Bill had set up the account in this manner, especially with only Joe listed as the beneficiary. Bill was not especially close to Joe. In fact, he had a stronger connection with my other children. The question nagged at me, and I contemplated reaching out to my wife and parents to discuss this new information, but I decided against it for the time being. The very next day, I visited the bank, knowing that as the executor, I had the authority to uncover more details about this mysterious account. I learned that Bill had opened the money market account just a month after Joe was born and had been consistently contributing to it every 2 weeks since then. At this point, I began to entertain unsettling thoughts. I wondered about the connection between Bill and Joe. Had there been an affair between Bill and Connie? Was Joe possibly Bill's biological son? The anxiety was overwhelming, and that evening, I returned to Bill's house, determined to scour through his files for any clues that could shed light on this troubling mystery. I spent hours searching through every corner of the house, hoping to find something that would help me make sense of this situation. Then, after an exhaustive search, I found it, a discovery that would forever change my life. I stumbled upon 2 old photographs of my wife, and they shattered my world in an instant. In the first image, she was shirtless, and in the second, she was completely nude, holding a beer. Both photos were taken in Bill's bedroom, the brother I lost. I felt utterly devastated and abandoned, struggling to reconcile the shocking evidence before me. I stayed at Bill's house for several hours that night, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. I oscillated between tears of betrayal and simmering anger, unable to process what I had discovered. As the night went on, Connie called to check on me, and I decided to head home. I knew I needed time to gather my thoughts before confronting her. Ignoring what I found crossed my mind briefly, especially since those pictures were from years ago and Bill was no longer around. However, the realization hit me hard. I could never live with myself if I chose to brush this aside. The next step was clear. I needed to confide in my parents about what had unfolded. The following day, I took some time off work and arranged to meet them at the farm office. I laid everything out for them, the bank statement displaying Bill's savings and the incriminating photos of my wife. Their reactions were immediate. They were visibly upset and repulsed by what I had shown them. My parents understood the gravity of the situation, just as I did. They asked what my plans were moving forward. I explained that I intended to confront Connie, and if her side of the story confirmed my worst fears, I would file for divorce. They were supportive, but my mom urged me to really listen to Connie and think carefully about my actions before jumping to any conclusions. That evening, after dinner, I took Connie with me to Bill's house under the pretense of cleaning and organizing. As soon as we stepped inside, I sat her down, signaling that we needed to have a serious conversation. I handed her the bank statement first. She glanced at it, visibly shocked, exclaiming, "Wow." She couldn't believe Bill had managed to save such a substantial amount. I prompted her to look for anything unusual on the statement, and she simply noted the high balance. Then I insisted she read it out loud, starting from the top. As she read through it, starting with the bank's name, then Bill's name, followed by "payable on death to Joe," our last name, her expression turned from confusion to devastation. It was in that moment I could see she realized she was cornered. She muttered, "I wonder why Bill did this," and I took the opportunity to ask if there was something she wanted to confess. She shook her head, insisting nothing was amiss. I pressed her for clarity, and she reaffirmed that she had nothing to tell me. I then handed her the photographs, and her face immediately froze, tears brimming in her eyes. She stammered that she needed to explain herself and hurried off to the bathroom. I heard her retching, the sound echoing through the house. When she finally emerged, she confessed to having an affair with Bill nearly 18 years ago. She labeled it stupid and selfish, claiming the liaison lasted only a couple of weeks. Connie insisted she had recognized her mistake quickly and ended it. She claimed she had distanced herself from Bill since then, only speaking to him in the presence of other family members. I posed a direct question: was Joe Bill's son? She answered emphatically that he was definitely mine. When I asked how she could be so sure, she replied that she just knew, and even if there was a chance he wasn't, she considered him mine because I had raised him. I cautioned her not to confuse the issues. This conversation was about her relationship with Bill, not my bond with Joe. Connie cried harder and pleaded for my forgiveness, but I felt no inclination to show her compassion or comfort in that moment. I stood up, telling her I needed space and that she shouldn't return home until she could collect herself. I didn't want our kids to see her in such a state. Once home, she came back about an hour later, continuously trying to engage me in conversation. I brushed her off, insisting we had time to talk later. That night, we shared the same bed, but I turned my back to her, refusing her attempts to snuggle. I could hear her silent tears, her sobs filling the void between us as sleep eluded her. The next day, I took off work again to visit my parents at their home. I recounted everything that had transpired, including Connie's confession. Their disbelief was palpable, as they struggled to process the weight of what I'd shared. I made it clear that my decision was definitive. I intended to divorce Connie. My mom asked me if this was truly what I wanted, and I had to admit that I didn't want any of this, but after everything Connie had done, I just couldn't trust her anymore. The thought of continuing the marriage felt impossible. After meeting with my parents, I returned home, and it was time to tell Connie my decision to file for divorce. When I broke the news to her, she completely fell apart. She begged and pleaded with me, saying that all of this was in the past, insisting that she understood Joe was my son. I had to remind her again that Joe wasn't the main issue here. My love for him wasn't going to change just because of who his biological father was. This situation was about the two of us, and she had betrayed me in a way that felt monumental. I stressed that it didn't make any difference if the affair had happened 18 years ago or even 1,000 years in the past, the pain and the betrayal were still real. Later that afternoon, I met with our lawyer who handles our farm matters. He suggested I consult a divorce attorney who was a friend of his, so I arranged to have an appointment with them later that same day to initiate the divorce process. Since our farm and the 3 houses were all part of a corporate structure, they were protected and wouldn't be at risk in the divorce settlement. However, the attorney laid out the reality regarding our other assets. He explained that they would likely be split evenly, regardless of the infidelity. He also brought up the fact that, since Connie had never worked outside the home, I might find myself needing to pay spousal support for at least 5 years, possibly longer. While he assured me we would fight this in court, he made it clear that this was the expected outcome based on his experience with similar cases. I was ready for that news, and to be honest, money wasn't my main concern. I just wanted to put an end to the marriage and move on with my life. When I returned home, I relayed the attorney's advice to Connie, and her reaction was heartbreaking. She broke down in tears, begging me for a second chance. I maintained my stance, repeatedly telling her no. I then informed her that I would be speaking to the kids that weekend, starting with Joe, and then bringing the rest of the kids together with him to discuss the situation. She asked if she could be part of that conversation, but I made it clear that I needed to talk to them first. She could meet with them afterward. Saturday morning came around, and I found some time to talk to Joe about something very important. We headed to the creek on the farm, where we have a pavilion and picnic benches, the kind of place where we've shared countless memories. It was there that I had to break the news to him. I could see the devastation wash over him as I spoke. He immediately expressed concern, asking if I would still love him even if he wasn't my biological son. I quickly reassured him that my love for him was unwavering, no matter what. I told him not to worry about that detail, my feelings for him and his siblings would never change. I explained that the issues at hand were strictly between his mother and me, and they were in no way to blame for what was happening. I made it clear that my decision to divorce was rooted entirely in Connie's affair with Uncle Bill, and had absolutely nothing to do with Joe or his siblings. We sat there discussing everything for a couple of hours. I informed him that the next step would be to meet with his siblings whenever he felt ready. He asked for a little time to prepare himself, and I told him to take all the time he needed to feel comfortable. When we returned to the house, we tried to act as if everything was normal, but it didn't take long for Connie's behavior to raise some red flags. The kids noticed right away that something was off. We spent most of the afternoon by the pool, engaging in our usual summer activities like playing cornhole and tossing the frisbee around. It felt like any other typical weekend, yet beneath the surface loomed the dark secret that was about to come to light. Later that evening, Joe approached me again, saying he was ready to talk to his brothers and sisters. However, they all had plans with their friends that night, so we decided it would be better to have the talk the following morning. Sunday came, and like any other week, we had breakfast together and went to church. After returning home, I gathered the kids on the back patio, saying I needed to talk to them privately. My daughter inquired if Mom would be joining us, but I replied that she wouldn't be part of that conversation for the moment. I could sense their unease as I prepared to share the news. When I finally told them, it was gut-wrenching to witness the shock register on their faces. Their reactions unfolded just as I expected. Disbelief gave way to anger, which ultimately morphed into sadness. I shared the news of my impending divorce from their mother with my children, and the reaction was immediate and heartfelt. Tears filled their eyes as the weight of the situation sank in. We engaged in an extensive conversation about the decision, navigating through their emotions until they began to grasp the reasoning behind my choice. My daughter was particularly expressive about her feelings. Her anger boiled over as she declared that she wanted nothing to do with her mother. I took a moment to remind them that, as young adults, they had the right to process this upheaval in their own unique ways. I encouraged them to refrain from making hasty judgments about their mother based solely on this painful moment. I urged them to reflect on the entirety of their relationship, which had been largely positive throughout their lives. While they understood my point, their anger lingered, and they were reluctant to see her anytime soon. In the midst of our conversation, I broached the topic of DNA tests for each of them. Their mother had claimed that her affair with Uncle Bill had been brief, but for my peace of mind, I wanted to verify the truth of their paternity. I reassured them that regardless of the test results, my love and commitment to them as their legal father would remain unchanged. They were, and always would be, my children, biological ties aside. Later that evening, their mother had an emotionally charged meeting with them in the dining room. I stayed outside, respecting their privacy, but could hear fragments of their discussion slipping through the door. By the end of the night, the children had expressed their love for her, but it was clear that their perceptions had shifted irreparably. They conveyed that while they loved her, they could never view her in the same light again and likely could not forgive her for her actions that had shattered our family. This was undoubtedly a difficult truth for her to absorb, but ultimately, she needed to hear it. From that moment until our divorce was finalized, my wife moved into the guest room, creating a palpable distance between us. The divorce process dragged on for nearly 8 months, during which my wife made daily pleas for us to consider marriage counseling and stay together. Despite her attempts, my resolve did not waver. 3 months after I discovered the affair, my parents received a lucrative offer from a developer to purchase our family home and the surrounding 80 acres. After thoughtful consideration, we decided it was a sound business decision to accept the offer. Consequently, my wife, our 2 youngest kids, and I packed up and moved out within 60 days. My wife soon relocated to a 3-bedroom apartment in town, and it was then that the full weight of reality hit her. The transition plunged her into a deep depression, requiring multiple medications just for her to cope with daily life. During this tumultuous period, I temporarily returned to my parents' home, using this chance to finally construct the dream house I had long envisioned on the back end of the farm. Collaborating with an architect, we designed a mid-sized log cabin featuring 3 bedrooms, a project that felt like a new beginning amidst the upheaval. The house is now complete, and I reside there with my 2 youngest children, who spend a few nights each week with their mother. While my ex-wife continues to grapple with her depression, there is a slow but steady improvement in her condition. She has expressed a desire to reconcile and rekindle our relationship, but I have no inclination to revisit that chapter of our lives. I treat her with respect, akin to someone I feel a duty towards, but the romantic feelings I once had for her have vanished completely. It's as if discovering the affair had turned off a switch within me. Though we maintain daily communication, I strive to keep our conversations focused on our children, being mindful of her situation. With no local support system, I find it difficult to sever ties entirely. I harbor a sense of obligation toward her, especially considering our shared history and the children's welfare. Regarding the DNA tests, the results confirmed what I had hoped: all of my children are indeed biologically mine. A wave of relief washed over me, but it also illuminated the unnecessary stress, drama, and sleepless nights that had plagued me since the affair came to light. However, the results did little to alter my feelings toward Connie. The betrayal was profound, and while I might never fully forgive her, I have come to accept it. A lingering mystery remains surrounding why Bill named Joe as the beneficiary on that account. My ex insists that they never discussed paternity, and I believe her. Perhaps he simply assumed Joe was his, or maybe he wished it were true. In general, I find myself at peace with my current life and the relationships I have rebuilt with my children and my ex-wife. While I know I can never trust her again, I do care for her well-being and sincerely hope she finds happiness in her own life. I can't really pinpoint why I felt the need to share this story, but writing it all down has somehow lifted a weight off my shoulders. It's amazing how putting thoughts into words can bring clarity and a sense of relief. Reflecting on everything that's happened has made me appreciate the outcome even more. I've gone through ups and downs, and now that I've put it all out there, it makes me realize how fortunate I truly am. If you've taken the time to read through my journey, I genuinely appreciate it. Your interest means a lot to me, and I hope everything goes well for you in whatever you're facing. Wishing you nothing but good luck in all your endeavors.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on the little bell icon for notifications of new stories.